Prudence L. Carter is Associate Professor of Education and Sociology at Stanford University, where she teaches a range of courses on racial and ethnic relations, social and cultural inequality, the sociology of education, and research methods. She is also the co-director, along with Linda Darling-Hammond, of the Stanford Center for Opportunity Policy in Education. Prior to joining the Stanford faculty in 2007, Dr. Carter was on the faculty of Harvard University and a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow with the program on poverty, the underclass, and public policy, and the program for research on Black Americans at the University of Michigan. A native Mississippian, Dr. Carter is a product of public schools in Clarksdale and Jackson. She graduated from Brown University with a Bachelor of Science program in Applied Mathematics and Economics, earned her master's and PhD in Education and Sociology from Columbia University. Dr. Carter's primary research and teaching agenda focus on enduring social and cultural inequality among social groups. Specifically, she focuses on academic and mobility differences attributable to racial, ethnic, class, and gender forces. We welcome Professor Prudence Carter to Your Education Matters. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Dr. Carter, in your research, you often talk of speaking with students to try to reveal and understand their point of view. Could we begin by talking with this experience you have of interviewing students and the sorts of things it reveals?
Sure. Well, I've been doing it since about 1995. So for just about, at this point, 17 years, I've been in the field. I started as a survey researcher, and one of the things we know with the survey research is that we can learn a lot about the outcomes for adolescents, for youth, for children. What are their test scores? What's their emotional well-being like? But for me, it was really important to understand how children make sense of these things, in education specifically. I find that we know a lot about what adults think that children do, but we don't know a lot about how children make sense of what they do, and how they explain many of the outcomes. So it was important for me when I started 15 years ago, particularly to try to understand how they felt their identities and their cultures mattered in the schooling process, how they engage with one another, how they engage with the material in school. Mm-hmm. And I, as a graduate student at that time, spent quite a few months in communities developing survey items, but also developing interview questions and just developing my skills as an ethnographer, but also just as a fellow human being, coming to know other youth at that time. And I've learned an amazing amount of things that I think could be useful for many researchers as they're developing the other kinds of survey item tools to measure and understand these wider scale phenomena that we're interested in education.
Well, I'm interested, you bring up the term identity. Mm-hmm. I wonder how much of a child's identity is up to them, that they are the actor in choosing it, how much is up to the parents and other adults around them, how about media? So from these conversations, what sense do you get of what constructs the identity?
Yeah. Well, kids, certainly there's a lot of external imposition on all of us in terms of our identity. In the United States, a very kind of hyper-racialized society, there's an identity of race that's often ascribed, and we can't control it, particularly if it's based on phenotype. There's gender. But I think the thing that children and adolescents make quite a bit of sense and meaning among themselves and their peer groups is what it means to be a part of a certain social group, particularly a peer group, or for them to make understanding what it means to be a boy or a girl, to be African American or Latino, or to be Indian or Native American. So what I find is children are often using their day-to-day interactions, how they interact, their kind of taste, the kinds of dynamics that exist among people, music, speech styles, and those kinds of things to make sense and to indicate or to symbolize what they mean by identity. And sometimes they want to kind of break the molds that have been created by the wider society, and they challenge and they will resist those molds. And in my first book, this is one of the things that I write about quite a bit, the utilizing their own, what we call agency, the ability to make independent choices for themselves. Now, how those choices play out in schools can sometimes create conflict and actually affect how well they are either perceived as very good students or actually bad students who have to be disciplined. But so the identity thing is a very interesting thing. It's constructed by kids, but it's also constructed by wider society for various historical reasons and economic reasons. Yeah.
I was at a meeting yesterday where a First Nations teacher was talking about her identity and how it was constructed and the pros and cons that were in her background, and she managed somehow out of this to construct what became a very successful career for herself and a great interface with Canadian society. But that's a challenge, and it's a little bit of a mystery how it happens. In your book, Keeping It Real, you talk about acting white. I think we have that phenomenon too with Indigenous people. What do you mean by acting white, and is that the way to go in constructing a remedy to the identity problem?
Well, the funny thing is, it's not so much about what I mean about acting white. I want to understand what youth mean by acting white when they invoke this term. And when I first started that research, I went into the communities that I studied, taking an understanding that anthropologists had already established. And I thought, well, these things sound a little funny or fuzzy to me, but I wonder if they really hold up in the contemporary era. And what I found is that the articulation by the youth whom I interviewed varied about what acting white meant, and it didn't quite converge with what we had in the academic research. It's a dominant, controlling articulation that one of the reasons many children from marginalized populations do not do well in school is because they see education, being successful in school, as the province of the dominant social group. And that means middle class, upper middle class white Americans in the US context. When I asked children about that, they did not disavow the value of education. That is not something they mean. What they are doing is using this as a term to kind of signify something about their cultural styles and taste. And so the four most prominent themes that came up through the host of interviews that I conducted were things about speech styles. It was about associations. With whom do you associate the most? And are your friends a part of the ethnic group or the ethno-racial group you're a part of, or are they mostly from another group? And if it's perceived that your friends, your styles, your taste, your interactions really emulate more of, in this case, whites as opposed to your own members, then you would be deemed as acting white. But it certainly wasn't about being smart or doing well in school, at least from what I found. But it's a controlling image. Many people, including our president in the United States, seem to equate it as with being kind of anti-intellectual, anti-achievement. And I just didn't find any indication that that's what children mean. It's an age-old concept, though. I mean, anthropologists saw the term of acting white actually started on the plantations in the American South. And it was really about, acting more superior or derogating your own set of what were perceived as your own set of cultural styles and tastes and ways of being.
Well, it seems as though it would help a teacher in those situations if they recognize that nuance of difference, that it didn't mean rejecting success at school or heading into a professional life. It's something about the authenticity of your interface with your own people.
Well, I will say, Paul, that one of the challenges, though, of adolescents circumscribing identity in the ways that they have done is that it kind of boxes them in often. And one of the arguments that I make in Keeping It Real is how is it that we as educators can work with youth, and we as educators ourselves, to cultivate what I call the kind of multicultural or intercultural identities so that children can partake in multiple cultural repertoires or sets and know which currencies culturally to use based on what setting they're in. And so if kids in the US for African Americans say that this is acting black, and it's a certain set of behaviors. What happens is that when they go into other settings where they are being expected to utilize other ways of being, other cultural forms, other practices, and they're trying to also maintain their Black identity as they've kind of narrowly defined it, they find some conflict, or they may not be as successful in those contexts. And so one of the things is, how do we get kids to the point where they see themselves as much more multifaceted? How do we get human beings, really, to get to the point where we all see ourselves more multifaceted and not so narrowly defined?
Well, that's what we're interested in as educators and as parents and just as people who want to build a fine society, is how can we have this identity formulate along the most constructive lines. And it doesn't mean inauthenticity or self-derogation, but finding a way to use your agency to select from the elements that could make up your identity. Now, from these conversations with students and from looking at your own life and people like Barack Obama, you know, what enables some people to pick their way through all of this? Do you see any themes or key factors? I mean, obviously loving parents, I suppose, and a stable economic situation for the family. Those, I would suppose, are givens, but beyond that, have your conversations with these young people showed you any key themes?
Well, one of the most determinative factors has been just what you said, the kind of what we call the social capital, the kinds of networks, the people who can model how it is that you can be your authentic self, but also how you can be your multifaceted self and take on multiple cultural currencies, speak different languages, use different codes. And the most successful kids, the ones I call, and I would say I call them the cultural straddlers. The cultural straddlers were the ones who could actually move more seamlessly across different cultural contexts, educational contexts, social context. And the one thing that I did find significantly different about them is they had someone in their life who was an exemplar of how to do that, or who actually instilled those kinds of values and ways of being in them. And the other two groups of kids that I found were the ones I call the kind of, they believed in education, but they didn't want, their kind of practices, ways of being in school didn't quite comply with what they believed in. And those students didn't really have the models in their lives. And then there were finally those kids who just kind of subscribed to the dominant ways of being in school context. Those were the mainstreamers. And they also quite rejected how their own groups defined what it meant to be a part of that group. And they were going to emulate the practices more of the kind of mainstream and the dominant social groups. And those kids are the ones who were more likely to be ridiculed. So you see those kids were using their agency in a lot different way than the ones who were the non-compliant believers. But the ones who were really moving across and could kind of handle the peer situation, the school situation, the work situation, they had someone to model it for them. It could have been an uncle, a cousin, a father, a mother, or even a teacher who had just taken some interest in them.
Well, one of the issues that comes up is when we have highly segregated schools, either by race or by class, whether there's a sufficient distribution of role models out there for a young person if all they see around them is other people who are living below the poverty level.
Well, now I will say that the sample of kids that with whom I spoke were all poor. And one of the objectives of this study was to, what we see in educational research is the tendency to homogenize peoples if they're a part of a particular social class. And this study did show that there's quite a bit of variation. We know that the material resource context matters because of just the correlations between those who are poor and those who are not doing as well educationally. Those who have been marginalized historically and those who are not doing as well educationally. But the ones who manage to make it up out of those contexts, in spite of it all, are the ones who actually have some mechanisms that are working for them. And so I would say that really having quality teachers who understand not just technically what it is they're teaching, the subject matter, but also knowing something about the social and cultural realities, material realities of their students really matter. And kids did talk to me quite a bit about that. It makes so much more sense when I know that the teacher understands something about me. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Prudence.
Yeah.
We'll be back in a moment.
When I arrived at SFU, I was ready to pursue my dream to become a physiotherapist, which all started back in high school with my passion for athletics. But then I took a health sciences course and discovered that at SFU, you have choices, incredible choices. It opened my eyes to a world of possibilities in global health. Possibilities for my future I had never considered, but I really struggled with letting go of my first goal. And that's when I found out how much support you get here. Incredible support, so you can really explore all those choices, think them through, and choose the path that's right for you. Faculty and staff paved the way for me and helped me navigate my new path, and I've never looked back. At SFU, you're part of a real community. The faculty and staff know who you are, what your interests are, and they really go out of their way for you. Research projects, conferences, international studies, co-op positions, student leadership. At SFU, you get the best education you could possibly hope for and the most support you could possibly ask for. And now that I've graduated, I'm packing my bags for Oxford to start my master's degree. Here's my plan. I see a need for better bridges between ideas and action in global healthcare. And if I can help build those bridges, that would be a really fantastic thing to do. I'm ready, and if you put your mind to it, you'll be ready too.
Dr. Carter, your new book is Stubborn Roots, Race, Culture, and Inequality in U.S. and South African Schools. Could you describe some of the work you've been doing there and how it connects to the conversation we've been having?
Well, let me first tell you about how I got to the place where I wanted to do research in South Africa. I visited the first time in 2001, and I was on a preliminary visit to a school that eventually ended up in the study. And I was out on the plaza talking to a group of high school students. It was a multiracial, multi-ethnic group. And I was really struck by the phenomenon of very poor township students who had moved into what were the formerly all-white schools under the apartheid government. And the schools had opened up, which is the word they use for desegregation in South Africa. And I asked this young man, I'll call him Sipho, I said, what is it like for you to move across your neighborhood boundary to this new school daily, and then to go back home and to come to this school? I mean, how are you received? And he said, well, you know, the funny thing is when we go back home, the kids from the township schools, they think we're, quote, acting white. And I was just really kind of flummoxed because I thought I was done with that topic in the American setting. And it just really spoke to the tensions of academic, economic mobility and the cultural issues that ensue for people who have been historically marginalized. And I thought, why not set up a study of two countries who have had to deal with kind of mobility issues for historically disadvantaged groups in their schools. One is a predominantly African and Black country, and the other is a predominantly white country. So the context just socio-demographically are different. The schools, the policy context are different. But what I ultimately found in the research is that what happens on the micro level in classes can converge despite all of that.
What happens on the micro level in schools
yes.
Can change all that or affect it. How about the material context? How about the economic resources that are available in each of these communities? Do you see the impact being significant, and is it similar in South Africa and the United States?
Well, it's actually much more disparate in the South African context. The overwhelming majority of African and Black children are in very poor schools in South Africa. It has a long way to go in terms of remedying the historical disparities that were just so rampant and stark under the apartheid regime. In the United States, we're a much wealthier country, upper income as opposed to a middle income country. But at the same time, you can see similarities between those kids who don't have the strong resource context in the schools. One of the main arguments for me is that while the material resource context of schools matter to imparting academic knowledge, to creating successful, engaged students, another structure that's deeply embedded in schools, no matter what, particularly when we open them up and we mix students across social classes, are the cultural structures. And that's really what Stubborn Roots wants to focus on, that it's not an either or, but it's a both and, that we must attend to both the material and cultural and socio-political dynamics in schools.
Canada feels very challenged, I think, in dealing with its indigenous people, and so this cultural aspect of schooling that you're talking about, have you seen things in South Africa or the US that we could learn from that help us bridge the cultural gap and allow children from all our different cultures, including our indigenous people, to succeed in school?
One of the things that I found, main findings were, is that one of the main findings is that educators vary in their approach to how they deal with issues of equity, and notice I say equity as opposed to equality, and inclusion of students who have been historically disadvantaged. The educators who took a much more radical egalitarian approach to the issues of equity, whether it's about material resources, teacher quality, exposure, additional enrichment, enhancement, as well as those who are being attendant to cultural issues like language differences, some of the material problems, how material issues can manifest in the family and home. Talking about this like rigid separation among peoples in the society. South Africa suffered from that for so many years, but really being more just attendant to those issues did much better than the schools that just allowed kids to come in and they had spatial proximity, but they didn't deal with it. And what the kids talk about is that they know there's a need. They have a need to really kind of attend to these issues, to talk about them with their teachers, to really diminish the palpable social boundaries that they feel exist between them and others in terms of inclusion. And they also struggle with the fact that they don't feel that their cultures are as respected as what's perceived as the mainstream culture or the dominant culture. And language is one of those things that comes out. I mean, something as simple as how you interact with school authorities. Deference to authority as opposed to, looking a teacher in the eye was a big one in South Africa, where in many African children, they are taught to respect elders by looking away. Whereas when they would get in school, if they didn't look the teacher in the eye when they were being scolded or reprimanded, they could get another demerit. And teachers were not aware of this. So one of the things I do discover is that teachers have to be as multicultural as we expect our kids to be in many ways. And a lot of our teachers don't have the knowledge base.
Now, if I were a teacher, I think I'd say to you in that situation, well, I can learn to accept this different cultural practice, but I'm also trying to get these young people to be successful in society. How do I do both? I don't mind if they don't look at me, but when they go out into the economy and want to find a job and move ahead, it's probably not going to work. So what would you tell a teacher asking you that?
And it's a process for both teachers and students that, yes, we all have to share a common communicative body of knowledge, of ways of being. And children have to understand, that goes back to my idea of our being multifaceted, being what I call multicultural navigators and keeping it real, in the sense that when teachers can convey and explain, and it's a kind of a process where teachers and students are co-learning about this, that, this is the currency we use here in this place. This is what will be effective in schools. And we also know that this is what will be effective in your communities. And let's actually talk about it explicitly. It's kind of like when we're traveling. We learn what currency is going to be utilized in this context versus this context. What are some of the social norms and cultural norms that would be appropriate in this context as opposed to this context? But you don't necessarily look down or denigrate. And I think in some of the ways with the kind of the assimilative process, we expect kids to get rid of. And that's what they're struggling with, because they do feel that there's a lot of integrity in their own cultures. And how do I maintain that and also respect what you're asking me to do in this school setting or in this work setting? And it's just effectively trying to convey and teach that.
Well, I hear you saying that not to underestimate the intelligence and adaptability of students. And if you lay out a path that honors their agency and identity, and at the same time comports adequately with the external economic world, you can help them, as maybe we have done and other professionals from ethnic minorities have done, to find a way through all of this and maintain your authenticity. That's what I hear.
Yes.
Now in the U.S., of course, the U.S. is proud of being an assimilationist country, whereas Canada is proud of being a multiculturalist country. I think when you go to South Africa, how do you feel about the assimilationist versus multiculturalist tension?
Well, South Africa fascinated me because it is a country that is multicultural. It is a country that it has one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. It is a country that is really trying. It's hard to implement multiculturalism deeply. We can do it symbolically and superficially, but deeply. And I think that's one of the challenges for that country. But a nation that at least is trying. How do I feel about it? I think it's respectable and honorable. I think taking the time to adequately do it is what's needed. A country like mine, which really has expected assimilation, culturally as well as socially and economically. I mean, obviously, assimilation economically can be a good thing in some ways if you can be a part. It depends on your politics about the political economic structure, of course. But it's been expected for immigrant groups, and whether those who are voluntary or those who've been enslaved, for a long time. And I think that's why we've had many issues, because students, as I said from the beginning, individuals come from places and cultural places and backgrounds that they respect and they love, but they're not valued in schools. And that's so it's problematic. And things that we see like discipline, dropout, disengagement, lower achievement, I would suggest to you are strongly associated with those things, but we can't really pick them up in lots of our studies because of the survey, the way we do them, actually.
Thank you very much, Prudence.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. There are answers to our social problems, including those in education. Democratic decision-making is usually the best way to find them. Your Education Matters strives to provide the information informed citizens need to support sound process in government decision-making about our public schools and universities. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters.